and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. We got a ton of stuff to talk about this week. We are getting back to normal-ish with some new public health restrictions, and the Prime Minister has brought in the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history. So we want to go through all of that. Plus, we got a bunch of other topics to talk about: gas prices, BC's new economic plan, all sorts of things. We got to bring in the pod squad and get right to it. You see them each and every week. Jillian, Katie, and McLean are here. Thank you for being here. And let's jump into topic number one, which is BC returning to 100% capacity for things like concerts and movie theaters, restaurants, nightclubs are back open again. And it sounds great, but it comes with little asterisks, which is you need to have your vaccine card and you need to have masks. And that's put BC just a tiny bit out of line with what some other provinces are doing. Most other provinces, actually, from Alberta to Quebec, setting a date to eliminate their vaccine card. So for some people, this is too fast. For some people, this will be too slow. We should go around and just talk a bit about it. Katie, what do you think of the reopening plan, how it was announced, and where BC is kind of positions itself on this issue?
Yeah, so I'll start with a disclaimer for all the internet trolls out there. I am very pro-vaccine. In fact, I support mass vaccine mandates over restrictions because we know that vaccines actually work, whereas restrictions, in my view, are largely performative and very annoying. But I do want to talk about the vaccine card a bit. In my view, the government's decision to extend the vaccine card is not based on evidence, as they've claimed. It's a political decision. And you see that because when the first and second justification for this policy is that people like it, and well, we just extended it a few weeks ago, that is a decision made by politicians, not public health officials. And one also thing that I'm noticing is when folks like the opposition or others ask the government to back up their decision, this decision specifically, with data, given the rest of the country is opening sooner, that doesn't make them anti-science, which is very much a stupid argument that I saw peddled on social media the other day. At the end of the day, the end of restrictions are in sight, which is great. That's what I care about. But I think that we, collectively should stop deluding ourselves into thinking that these are entirely evidence-based decisions, which is the most misused and politically hijacked term arguably in existence today.
Yeah, I mean, Premier Horgan was there, so that does certainly add a political dimension to it. He was asked a bit about the politics and the science, and, on vaccine cards, he said he likes that there is a partly a scientific part to it, which Dr. Henry has said, if there's an outbreak at an event and everyone's vaccinated, the chance that it overwhelms the local hospital because everyone is seriously sick is less. So he said that, but then also he feels people are comfortable with it. And he wants it to continue to encourage vaccination rates. So not all of it, you're right, is science, but nobody else across the country is just using science anymore. All the premiers are rolling up their sleeves and getting into the politics. Jillian, how do you kind of reconcile all of this?
Yeah, I think actually it was good to see that the government has learned some lessons from previous times where we've eased up on restrictions too fast and had to put them back in. I think what we're seeing in the broader political context is a very tenuous situation for public trust right now. And I think sort of whiplash between restrictions every time there's a new variant is part of what's causing that. So I think that it is prudent to keep these two measures in at this time. Because we don't know. We simply don't know if the next one's going to be, milder like Omicron was, or less, or just as transmissible if you're vaccinated like Omicron is. So I was glad to see it. I think, in particular, masks are a no-brainer for me. I think where it will start to become troubling is that as we get into tourist season and we start to see, more and more people coming over the border, both from the States and internationally and from other provinces where the expectations are very different. And I think that's why the government has kind of put these sort of loose markers of when they're going to review the policy in place without saying with certainty, because there is really no way to be certain if we've learned one thing from the pandemic.
Yeah, it is going to be weird to have people from other provinces arrive in BC, like Alberta and Saskatchewan, which have no vaccine card at all right now, show up here and have to do proof of vaccination, or when they drop their masks entirely at the end of February, show up here and have to put masks back on. You're right, that sort of spring break, maybe tourist season is going to be really weird for BC if it's slightly out of alignment with the other provinces. McLean, what do you think?
You mentioned John Horgan mentioning the vaccine cards, encouraging vaccination rates. We're at something like 92%. That's at a certain point, the 8% or whatever of British Columbians that have refused to be vaccinated up till now, I think that's baked in. And if you'd told us 2 years ago that we would achieve 92% vaccination, we would have just called it a win and moved on. But I don't know that the vaccine cards are going to encourage any more people to get vaccinated because, I mean, we've tried it. It actually did have some effect. It was a positive development, but those returns are diminishing from this point on. And so, I mean, again, to Katie's point, to say that it's scientific, it's just, that's not what it is. I was discussing this in a friendly way with an NDP MLA on Twitter this week, and what I got in response was, well, if you know anyone in the service industry, you'll know that this they feel good about this. I agree. I don't doubt that. It's probably true, but that is also not scientific.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it's there are elements of politics here. I like your point, though, that you're right at the beginning. If we'd reached this, if we had proposed a path to reach 92% vaccination, everyone would have been like, unfurl the mission accomplished banner, because that is great. But we're just stuck with a hardcore group of anti-vax or anti-authority or pro-choice or however you want to view it, people who we may not be able to reach. Is anyone here okay with walking into a restaurant without a mask tomorrow? Would anyone be okay with that? I would still be a little bit freaked. Oh, you'd be okay? Yep. I would be a little freaked out. McLean?
What I mean, is there any more obvious bit of COVID theater than walking into a restaurant for 30 seconds with your mask on, sitting down for an hour eating and drinking with no mask on, and then putting your mask on for the 30 seconds it takes you to get to the door?
Exactly.
At what point do we say, well, the masks aren't really all that useful? You're not wearing it for 95% of the time you're in there. Yep. Yes, I would be comfortable removing that 5%.
Those 30 seconds, I love that mask. Jillian, am I out of line?
Well, I think that I think that it's on the positive side, we're seeing the government be a little bit more transparent over the fact that these decisions are not entirely scientific from the standpoint of always stopping transmission in every single instance. I think that it is necessary if you're going to have masks in other situations, when you go into a store or when you whatever you go to an event. It makes sense to kind of keep people in the practice of it. I think it makes sense to me. I don't really have a problem with it. To me, it's a relatively small imposition in my life.
I want to know what kind of self-respecting 19-year-old is going to go to a nightclub and dance wearing a mask. Like, that to me is hilarious.
I know. How do you put the glow stick in your mouth when you're dancing if you've got the mask on? I don't understand.
You just need a hole for the shots.
This will have to remain a mystery. This will remain a mystery to everyone on this panel.
Maybe the mask has the glow stick on it. I don't know. But anyways. Moving on to our second topic, which is the Emergencies Act, and the Prime Minister declaring that this week. The Emergencies Act has never been used before. It replaced the War Measures Act. It gives Ottawa sweeping powers to declare mainly the border areas, but also Parliament Hill, protected places, move in and arrest protesters, try to clear the trucker convoy anti-vaccine mandate protests that have popped up and I think are in day 20 in Ottawa. But as we record this on Friday, there are efforts being made to arrest those protesters under the act. So there are some people who think this was long overdue. Others, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, plans to take the federal government to court for an infringement on charter rights because of this. So there's a kind of a spectrum of people who think whether this was the right move. McLean, where do you land, and do you think this was always inevitable, or was this a surprise that this happened for you?
I was surprised that they invoked the Emergencies Act. The clauses in the Act, which was enacted in 1988, and as you point out, has never been used ever since. It's very clear. People's lives have to be at risk, and there has to be a failure by other levels of government to deal with it. I'm not diminishing what's happening in Ottawa. I would probably be moved to violence myself if I was subjected to a week of horn honking. But it is difficult to see why municipal, and in Ontario's case, provincial police couldn't intervene. I don't know why. You mentioned the Emergencies Act. It is the successor to, you pointed out, the War Measures Act. That was only used 3 times in Canadian history. The first 2 world wars, and in 1970, the October Crisis. which at the time seemed like even then an overreaction. And then as we learned afterwards, it was literally chasing down maybe 10, 15 extremists. And so probably was an overreaction to have soldiers on the streets. So to see it being used for an admittedly very disruptive and very illegal and awful occupation, there's a gross potential for overreach there, and I worry about the implications moving forward.
Yeah. Katie, right move by the Prime Minister or not, do you think?
No, and I think McLean's terminology is sound. This is a gross overreach of power, which now at least 6 premiers now oppose. I think this is the government scrambling to be reactive when they should have been proactive. And no, I vehemently disagree with the measures that they're undertaking right now. What I am concerned about is like the state of our country's politics right now. Over the last week, the Attorney General of Canada stated that private citizens with pro-Trump views should be worried about having their bank accounts frozen. The Prime Minister of Canada accused a gay Jewish MP of standing with protesters bearing swastikas. And people who donated as little as $25 to the convoy have now had their personal information gleefully released by Liberal partisans on social media for the deliberate purpose of destroying their livelihoods. So I don't care what side of the protest you're on. What has transpired this week should be incredibly concerning for all Canadians. And I really worry that this is the most divided our country has ever been. And I don't see it getting better anytime soon. And that makes me like physically ill.
But on the other hand, it seems like a complete failure by Ottawa police and others to have cleared the Parliament Hill protest. There was a disruption in Windsor of the Ambassador Bridge and trade and millions of dollars being disrupted. We saw the Pacific Highway crossing being closed down in BC. Somebody had to do something, and it seems like it ended up back on the lap of the Prime Minister, and this is the way that he chose to deal with it. Jillian, is that, I mean, from my point of view, I don't necessarily see it as maybe a huge overreach if those people are blocking critical infrastructure. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that I hope that the police are successful today, and they obviously should have done this, days, if not weeks ago, probably weeks ago, from the perspective of people in downtown Ottawa. But, Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, skipped 3 meetings with the Prime Minister. Like the other premiers and the Prime Minister basically had to stage an intervention with him to get him to go anywhere near this. I think that we're seeing, a buildup of multiple failures from all levels of government. It never should have come to this. And I think, there's a lot to answer for why there has been the mistrust on the part of the protesters that have brought them to this point, why there is the mistrust from Canadians in the ability of our politicians to handle it once it got to this point. And I think, to Katie's point, I think that continuing to turn up the political rhetoric and taking, making every decision to devolve this into the most heated possible partisan debate is a mistake. And I think, we had an election. That's the time for politics. It's past now. We have a lot of hard questions to ask ourselves coming out of this.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I agree with Katie as well. It really is a dangerous divide that we're seeing in partisan politics right now, and in the way that people are attacked personally, and professionally, and their personal lives and views are all under a different type of kind of seems like horrendous kind of microscope at this point. But I think we'll come back to that in a minute, because we're going to do a bit of a grab bag where we talk about some of the things that have been on our mind during the week. And I think a lot of us have been thinking about this particular case as well. So if we go around, I mean, there's lots of other stuff that was happening. The legislature remains in session. We have a budget next week that we'll probably talk about more when the budget actually comes out. But Jillian, was there anything that caught your mind this week that you want to just talk a bit about?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the government's economic strategy that they rolled out this week. They had been hyping it up for a couple weeks, talking about the changes in our economy, some of the demographic shifts, all of the worker shortages that we're going to see in coming years, and that's already playing out. Driving up the cost of construction. We're seeing not as many early childhood educators, shortages in our healthcare system for workers, and lots of burnout in that industry. So this is a plan that really focuses on that, on making sure that we have the workers that are trained up with the skills that we're going to need. I think that's the good part of it. I think the other good part of it is, it was really encouraging to see a focus on climate change and sustainability, as well as sort of looking at economic indicators that go beyond just sort of growth and employment, looking at, what's the quality of those jobs, of incomes, what's the quality of life for people. On the other hand, I think the shortcomings were that it was sort of the bare minimum of what you'd expect based on the changes that we know are on the horizon for our economy. And it was a lot of things that had already been announced. So I think the government, overplayed their hand a little bit in hyping it up so much. It'll be interesting to see if we get more details in the budget that sort of match the sort of excitement and rhetoric that they built up around it. But with the plan out as it is, it was a little bit underwhelming.
Yeah, it was a little vague. I didn't see a lot of kind of concrete sort of timelines and benchmarks. There wasn't a lot of money attached to it. There were parts of it that felt like it was the NDP's 2020 election plan promise, platform mashed up with last week's throne speech and kind of merged together and sort of economic plan put on the top. But Katie, I just want to bring you in quickly on this because you having worked in premiers' offices, I feel like to balance that perspective out, there must be a lot of pressure on a government to at least think about the long term, set some type of plan, set something beyond the day-to-day, and then they'll inevitably get criticized for it being vague. And in this case, we're criticizing it because it's vague and it seems lame, but don't they have to do that as well? Isn't that kind of a balance?
Absolutely. You want to set out a long-term vision, and it's particularly relevant as we start to hopefully really this time come out of COVID. The BC Liberals had the BC Jobs Plan. We had the Skills for Jobs Blueprint. It's incredibly important in government not only to adhere to the commitments that you made during an election to British Columbians or whoever your citizenry is, but also to set out a long-term aspirational vision. This is why Christy Clark was so successful in 2013, I would argue, with her vision for LNG. So, removing my partisan hat, yes, it's incredibly important that government have both short-term goals for their citizens as well as a long-term vision.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little groan-worthy when you're covering it or when you're viewing it and you're trying to explain to people, like, what is this? Like, does it do anything for your life? The answer is, well, no, but it takes, people who voted for the party. It takes those terms, those commitments, those values. It puts them into a document that I guess the government refers back to when it's trying to find guiding principles for the economy. So I don't begrudge the government for doing it. I just was not, I think, Katie, to Gillian, to your point, it wasn't, would have been nice to have some more specifics in there. But anyways, that's a good one. McLean, what's in your mind this week?
Well, we talked earlier about COVID theater. Let's talk about political theater here and the price of gas, which if you live in the Lower Mainland or like I do on Vancouver Island has just set another record. It's never been higher and it's only going to go up. The problem for the NDP is that they explicitly promised to do something about this when it was much cheaper than it is now. They launched a review which was explicitly prohibited from looking at the role of government and taxes in the price of gas, and came back with, well, really not a lot of answers, and everyone would be happier if we just forgot about that and pretended it didn't happen. But the issues come up because it's getting more and more and more expensive. This issue isn't going to go away. The NDP made a lot of promises on affordability that have not panned out, from relatively trifling things like the cost of your cell phone bill to housing. And so I think this is going to be a mounting issue over the next couple of years heading into whenever the next election is. Yeah.
Affordability is this fantastic winning issue for political parties in opposition, promising to make things more affordable. And then you get into government and they become this sort of albatross, the stone around your neck that you're dragging everywhere, whether you can affect the issue or not. Gas pricing is a classic one where technically, really, there's not much government can do. It's a market that a small number of companies own the oil and gas distribution and retail in BC. And then what it can do, reduce taxes, the carbon tax or the fuel tax. That's $3 billion in revenue the government doesn't want to touch because it's trying to spend it elsewhere. But it talks about affordability. And I think it's interesting to watch Kevin Falcon as the new Liberal leader make affordability really one of his issues. And he's bringing it up again and again in question period. He's talking about tackling those things, and it works in opposition. But in government, you then have to wear it every time the inflation is up, the cost of meat is up, cell phones are up, house prices are up, rent is up, and gas prices are up, and you can't or won't do anything about it. So it's that it's that kind of winning double-edged sword, I think, which is fascinating to watch. Katie, what's on your mind?
Okay, what I want to talk about is so random, but I'm very, very passionate about it. And that is terms that have become unnecessarily politicized. And I've got three, I'm sure there's dozens more. So, number one, the term evidence-based decisions. So this used to mean a process for making the best decisions possible using the evidence available. And now I would argue it's been co-opted by any smug jackass that wants to shame someone that doesn't strictly adhere to their ideological beliefs. Number two is follow the science, which during all of COVID sounded quite reasonable. However, I would argue that this has been hijacked by ideologues in the scientific community who claim to have an ironclad monopoly on all COVID-related scientific thought and exploration. And for a great example of that, look at David Feisman of Ontario's Science Table. And finally, freedom. And this one is just tragic. So freedom is obviously an unassailable right of all Canadians to act, think, speak without constraint. And now some are actually saying that this is a term that should be avoided because it's been co-opted by the alt-right. So this is incredibly concerning to me because I think that maybe over the last 2 years, especially, like, words have been weaponized to an unprecedented degree. And I just think there needs to be more awareness about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. All that, I mean, especially on social media, that terminology can be used by anti-vax, anti-science, anti-authority. They can be used by people who are trying to make their point for a political purpose or whatever. No, I agree. It's hard. Follow the science, and I mean, it's come up in BC politics too a bit, and it's just it's very difficult. I agree with you. Those are frustrating terms. And I think that's a good one as well. We're going to be back next week with the BC budget, which I think will be an interesting one. There's a lot of pressures on government all over the place. Are we through COVID? Are we into recovery? Do we still have to worry about the healthcare system, which is under immense pressure? Renegotiating all the government public service contracts, which are up this year. All sorts of stuff going on there. So we'll be back next week to talk to you about that and all the latest in BC politics. Make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching Political Capital.